looking at that incident, and that's all I was looking at. But what we know is that child abuse is a symptom. People don't intentionally harm their children just because they're evil people. We'll talk about the risk factors and the things that lead up to that. Very few people are intentionally being evil and harmful and torturous of their children. I mean, that's a very small margin of people that truly do that. And there are those that do, and we read all those paper stories of the awful things people can do to children. So if we look at just the incident, we miss the picture. And probably we'll be back in that family another day for another referral because we didn't give the parents the abilities that they needed to cope with what was going on. So if they go in now and do the full family functioning assessment, which is the new model that Montana has switched to, they're looking at the full functioning of the family. What is the parents' general functioning? What is the parents' parenting functioning? You know, they're looking at a lot of functioning right up front, because those are the things that are leading or causing a parent to abuse their child. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we've shifted from A equals B, it's very linear. Did it cause it? Not. Okay, substantiate, I'm out of here. That doesn't work. What caused this to happen? What's going on? What straw broke the camel's back? And what can we do to help you so that doesn't happen again? Or are there supports we can pull in so that that's not going to happen again? Because we don't want to leave children in harm's way. But I have to tell you, the damage that's done when children are removed from their home and placed in substitute care is egregious. Especially if it's not done in a thoughtful way, in a planned way. We didn't look at kin first. We didn't look at people that knew them. They aren't keeping connections with their people. We all have a community, right? Kin means anyone that I think of as family or support. In Montana, kin is anyone that the child had a significant relationship with before they came into care. So they can be placed with those individuals that had a strong relationship with them prior to them coming into care, rather than stranger foster care. Because now kids are aging out for generations, and what we're hearing from them is, I just wanted you to help me make it stop. I didn't want this to all happen.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And
So-
remarkably, it's so interesting, even with a lot of our kids that we do have in long-term custody, how much they still love their parents. And they can be abused to no end, but that love will never go away. And really helping kids and helping the parent to embrace that and know that is pretty cool. I also think that with this new model, again, it's that rapport that you build with a family and really help them. If they're actually going to parent these kids, you have to move them through a period and an ability to understand how their behavior has affected the development of their kids, and nobody wants to hear what they've done wrong. And so, but really,
None of us.
well, none of us do. Come on, yeah, right. But it's so it's just really.
We have to build empathy about our parents.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know the journey that brought them here, so we need to be kind.
Yeah. Well, are there services? Are there many services for the parents? I mean, you always hear about cutbacks and everything. And
It depends on what the service needs are. We are definitely limited. I do have to say that, the more cuts that happen for human services every time the legislature goes into session, the trickle down is that children become abused. You just heard Bill say, oh my gosh, we've got an awful lot of cases, and you might be getting one faster than you want to, and it's because there's too much going kind of on as far as the economy and the lack of services and the lack of social workers in our community right now, because not everyone's excited about change. Change is scary. So when the CPS world said this isn't working and we need to find a new way, new to Montana is the way that we're looking at programs that have been going on in other states for years and years. And it's evidence-based
We are
practice.
so behind.
Well,
But we aren't, actually.
Well, and it doesn't mean that we're behind. It means whomever was in charge and making decisions for a very long time as an agency maybe didn't understand the big picture. When you know better, you do better, right? That's my hope for parents, and it's our hope for all of us, that when we learn there's a better way to do it, that's what evidence-based practice is. There's always somebody who's figuring out the next thing that actually works well. I mean, how many children had to age out of system and tell us how horribly we failed them before as a division we went, okay, we gotta find a new way to do business, right? So,
How often do you get a lot of cases with, because this is a real frustrating one for me, is autistic kids.
frustrating meaning,
let's say you have a 16-year-old autistic boy that's also got some mental illness and can hardly talk. I mean, and the parent, he's got very anger issues. Well, you know, how do they let out their feelings if they can't talk? They get agitated inside, let it go, maybe throw things, break a faucet. I mean, this is real stuff that I've seen. And neighbors call, cops come, they take this autistic kid to jail who don't know what's going on because nobody knows what to do with it. What do you guys do in those cases?
Well, the thing to keep in mind about Child Protective Services is that our role is to look at, is a child being abused or neglected in their environment by their caregiver, so the person that's legally responsible for their care and well-being. So if there's stuff that's happening with a teenager that's not directly caused by a parent's lack of ability or act or omission of the
Because he's
parent.
out of control.
Yeah, and we don't hold parents accountable for teenagers
Okay.
who are out of control. So it's not, I mean, kids running at large and not listening and not doing their thing becomes a juvenile delinquency issue. It's no longer, and I know that that's not the best way to deal with our mentally ill or kiddos on the autistic spectrum, but we're pretty limited for services for mental health, and I don't really know what they always get and receive. And so while we wouldn't be involved unless the issue was supervision or lack thereof or something a parent was doing, we just don't have the statute authority to be involved
Okay.
with just that kiddo who's now gone to jail.
What if they're really young, like a
Yeah.
7-year-old who does something very violent? I mean,
It's-
obviously to me, there's something in the family that would, or the care that would cause that, but.
And that's
still-
possible. If the behavior that's happening in the house is causing a child to have a mental health issue or acting out behaviors, we probably heard about them or seen them. They're not in school long before teachers start recognizing there's some pretty significant stuff going on here, and they'll make that first referral to CI for, they're, whatever it is. Whatever those symptoms are that they're seeing about them.
So, do you have any referrals for parents that might come to you and say, I have this autistic child and, they might body hold him to hold him down, which to me isn't abuse unless
No,
Restraint
you're,
is
you're
not
trying to
abuse.
keep it safe,
my guess is,
So if they come to you and say, we don't know what to do no more,
And you get that a lot.
Yep.
People do try to voluntarily just kind of say, I'm not doing this anymore.
but I mean, what if, not even if they don't want
If
to
they
give up
call the
rights?
hotline and they
Just
say,
want
I need
help.
help, there are, depending on what community they live in, there are requests for service. There's different categories. When somebody calls centralized intake, and they might have covered this the other day, they're gonna take the information and they're gonna decide, first, how does this fit? Is it a CPS matter? Is it really a parent or a caregiver that this person's talking about? And if it is, then okay, that meets the legal definition of, is it our matter to even look into? If they decide that it's not, but this parent's asking for services, it's called a CFS, or request for services, and those go to the supervisors in that county, and hopefully they're passing on some information to those parents the best that they can. It just depends on what the community resources are. We wouldn't go out and we're not service providers. The service that CPS provides, the population we serve is unsafe children that are unsafe because of their caregivers' acts or omissions, not because they're mentally ill, or not because they have an autistic spectrum disorder, or not because they have a cognitive delay. And while we can try to plug them in where that goes, it wouldn't be something that we would be able to spend a ton of time on. So parents would hopefully get some information or guidance about resources, but it really depends on what the community has to offer, right?
Yeah.
So it is unfortunate. There are times though, like Erika was discussing, where a parent has a child coming out of a residential facility and their mental health issues are such that parent says, I'm not picking them up because I cannot bring them home. They're jeopardizing the safety of their siblings in the home by their acting out behaviors. And then unfortunately you do end up have to maybe hold a parent accountable for abandonment, but I gotta tell you, I understand where they're coming from and the difficulties that must be to say, I can't pick them up, I love them, but I can't bring them home.
Now, we're almost back to where I was at my 45-day question.
Okay, go again.
You're holding a parent responsible for abandonment, but what do you, is there any adverse action against a parent for,
Well, if they meet the
Abandonment?
legal statute for abandonment, yeah, there's like criminal penalties, but we work within a civil system,
yeah?
so we're not the hold people accountable
Right, I know that.
system, so abandonment would mean then that there would be, maybe a substantiation against them, which means yes, the act or omission did occur, yes, they did abandon them, there's a preponderance of evidence to support that they abandoned this
Okay.
child. So within the civil system that we work, there's that. Criminally, it's up to Tara in our
Yeah.
community, the county attorney's office, to decide if they were gonna do something criminally for a parent, to
In
hold them
other words,
accountable.
there would be at least presumably some application of common sense before,
Yes.
charges were filed.
Yes.
Oh gosh,
Now-
yeah.
Okay, every situation is different. That's the beauty of this too. Every situation is different. So now this kid that's coming out of Chaudere, that there's a 1 and 2 year old in the home, and this is a 7-year-old who is sexually acting out, who's physical, who's totally unmanageable, and mom says, I can't come pick this kid up. Okay, here's the still 7-year-old, still 2 and 1 year old. Mom's out drinking, mom's out partying, mom hasn't made her meetings at the treatment facility, mom hasn't followed through, mom hasn't showed up for visits. When she did show up for that one, she was drunk. We're gonna handle these completely differently.
Yes.
I mean, what is a parent willing to do for their kids? And again, I mean, it's just very situational. And so to hold, which we do, we have to hold the same standards, and yet we really have to work with families' individuality, because going back to that, there's so few families that don't want the best, and it's hard. It is. It's really hard, and it's ugh.
So, are we supposed to get through this whole thing?
Right?
Well, we're gonna get through a
I'm
lot
just
of it.
curious.
We are gonna get through a lot of it because
Okay.
the discussion we're having right now, as we start looking through it.
Yeah, we're gonna
It's
fly
actually
through.
here.
I was just
Yeah.
worried.
Yep.
Yeah, no, gosh, we're not gonna keep you past our time. I've been training new workers all day. I'm ready to go home. I won't keep you past 7:15. So let's look ahead here a little bit. Psychological abuse is really difficult. That is defined as severe maltreatment through acts or omissions that are injurious to a child's emotional, intellectual, or psychological capacity to function, including the commission of acts of violence against another person that resides in their home. However, it doesn't mean that we hold mom accountable because she can't even keep her own self safe. She's being battered. Okay, there's times where we're gonna get those referrals anytime there's domestic violence in a home, and that's the bottom statement here. However, psychological abuse or neglect cannot be construed to hold a victim responsible for failing to prevent the crime against themselves. Okay, but that's a tough one, because isn't mom accountable to keep her kiddos safe if they're living in a home with domestic violence? Yes, she is. So the first time, sometimes the second, third, fourth time, we're gonna be doing what we can to help that victim, but eventually our role,
Is that kid?
we do kids.
Yep.
So we're gonna offer services, we're gonna get her plugged in, we're gonna hope that, it won't take the 7th time, which is the average time, 7 times before a mom will actually leave a lot of times.
And we're
Domestic
lucky.
violence is difficult to understand for those of us that have never lived it.
Do you get very many men?
Yes.
that
Not
get
many,
abused?
not many. I
that are
won't
the
say many,
victim?
but yes. And more, because I think that as as a society, we really view it as a male dominant as the
Always been
perpetrator,
there, yeah.
and it's not. I
No.
mean, and more, I think, in my opinion, and it could be
It's
wrong,
coming
but lots more women perpetrate it because they think that they're going to get away with it. And I still think that they do. I mean, I will even say that I think that they do. It's
Well,
Yeah.
men aren't gonna say, right?
I
Men
don't
are
think- I
gonna
don't think-
say.
A
I
lot
don't-
of the thing is that, when men, they feel funny saying
Yeah.
I'm getting hit at or
Yeah.
spit in the
My
face
wife is
at.
abusing me.
Yeah.
right.
I mean, they feel like, and so they'll,
See.
yeah,
It's
that's
way
coming
under-
out more.
It's really underreported, as
Yeah.
all crime and abuse and neglect are underreported for everybody. But at the end of the day, what we're hopeful is that we can provide services to keep a child safe. We'll always have to be very upfront and clear with a parent, a mother, a father, You know, while I understand that you have the right to make these decisions for yourself, I can't stand by and let you keep making decisions for your child that put them in harm's way, okay? Because the likelihood, okay, so you have the kiddo who's in crib, a babe in arms, can't get up and move around, but they hear it. What we know is the studies show those children are changed. The way their brains are wired changes when they live in chaos, and that fear, they feel that all of the time in their home. It doesn't let them be freed up to developmentally grow and learn as they should, because that tension and that worry for their people in their home and that violence that's going on around them changes who they are.
We just did a in-service training like 4 months ago with Liz
Awesome.
Holstead. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Liz is awesome.
Yeah, she is amazing. I mean, just the
Is she local?
from Intermountain.
Yeah, Liz is the one that does the abusive head Colstead.
Colstead. I thought you said Olson.
No,
Sorry.
Her
Colstead.
brain's ragging. So, we do have to get referrals. When law enforcement goes out and it's a domestic violence call, they have to, they're mandatory reporters, they have to call centralized intake, and then a worker needs to go out and assess the situation and try to offer some support services to the victim. Explain the child's, need for that not to be the way their life is, and then hold them accountable to some extent. And yet, you can't, a lot of workers I hear them saying, well, I made her go get a protective order. Well, is that really helpful? Not so much. It's a piece of paper, and while it's a good idea if she's truly fearful and needs that protective order to keep herself safe, it doesn't mean the kid's safe. So it's a difficult, though domestic violence, I will tell you, is probably the worst cases I had, just because they're so hard. They're hard to validate with the person, in that it's hard to hold a victim accountable for being victimized in front of their child. It's a really difficult case. It's that psychological abuse, and the reality is psychological abuse is hard to prove. I can't say, as a layperson, even as a CPS worker, when that was my role, what is psychological abuse. You need to have a mental health professional who's willing to come forward and say, this act by this person injured this child intellectually and emotionally, and here's evidence to support that. So then you have to start backing up. Okay, let me talk to some teachers. How did this kiddo behave before mom got this boyfriend? What things have you seen change now that they're in their household? So I can present to a court, this is who this child was before. This is how this child appears after. Is there something that you're willing to do, Your Honor, to hold this situation accountable? And sometimes it gets to the point where you say to them, if you can't keep them safe, we're going to have to. And so that's when you're looking at the physical neglect, because remember, if you go back to physical neglect, it's an exposure to an unreasonable risk. And that's an exposure to an unreasonable risk. Just like putting them in your car and driving drunk. Just like letting a sex offender live in your home or babysit your children. So eventually there's an attempt to hold parents accountable for those things, but we really are all about keeping families together and not pulling them out of their home if we can at all help it.
Can I ask you what the law is on what you just brought up on perpetrators? I mean,
It's a joke.
Well, one question I want to know is, let's say they live in a fourplex, and there's kids around. Is there a law that they have to let anybody know? Or the
Yes.
landlord has to?
If
or-
they're a registered sex offender, they have to be registered within the community. Whether they have to notify somebody that they're a registered sex offender, I think that's dependent on whether they're on probation or parole, or whether there's requirements that
So they wouldn't
have.
have to let the neighbors know?
Well, they don't have to knock on the door and say,
No.
I'm a sex offender
Yeah,
who's
but I
registered.
know-
But they have to,
Well, no, I know that.
they have to register in the community, and then,
Right.
yes, that information is accessible
Okay,
to
I wonder if
anybody.
that's still, okay.
And now remember, there's all different kinds of sex offenders. Okay.
Mm.
So to say, and I mean, on the one hand, you
Oh,
can
yeah.
generally say, for the most part, nobody wants a sex offender living with a kid. But really, truly, there are those isolated situations that is an age that it was a consensual act, that they are now a registered sex offender. To further that,
Statutory rape.
yep, right. To further that, it depends whether they're on paper, if you will, probation, parole, as to whether or not they have requirements as to who they can be around and who they can't be around. Once they've completed their probation and parole, they're off paper, and that means there is no restrictions. that means they can be tier 3 sex offender raising 3 little girls that are the age of their
previous
victim.
victims. The other thing is we can't lump all individuals
Exactly.
who've committed sexual offenses as pedophiles.
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
just
because they're not.
Just because
Oh.
you've committed a sexual offense doesn't mean you're a risk to a child.
Right.
So be really careful of that. I'm not saying people who do sexual violence against anyone is a good thing. I'm just saying sex crimes don't equal pedophilia or an opportunistic perpetrator, which is the majority of what you deal with for children's sex crimes, is somebody who's opportunistic. They don't necessarily have a full, interest or only desire in a certain child's age or whatnot. That's a specific category. Most people are opportunistic. Or drugs. The drug issue,
Oh,
meth and meow, all stimulate a place in the brain that increases their sexual desire. And so they make really bad, poor choices if they have the opportunity and there's a child available. They'll probably perpetrate.
pornographic material is very indicative of, and slews of pornography.
The children being exposed to pornography. People are
Yeah,
allowed to
which-
have pornography. That's
No,
not what we're saying.
yeah, no, true. But
We're adults. Adults can have pornography. What we're saying is when law enforcement goes into a home and there's sex toys and pornography around, usually if it's out like that, it's because there's drug activity going on in the home too, and they're not using the
not using
same
their filter
choices exactly.
properly.
And it does, it stimulates that part of the brain that creates sexual desire in a really strong way. And so even if they're maybe not perpetrating children are being exposed to adults having sex. So they're having knowledge they shouldn't have, which brings us to this next piece, which is sexual abuse by persons responsible for the welfare of a child. We would do an investigation if it was the caregiver again who was perpetrating the child. We would also do an investigation if we felt like the parent wasn't keeping a kiddo safe from a perpetrator. So, teenage brother is perpetrating, younger sibling. Mom knows this but hasn't done any measures or protective action to keep that kiddo safe from being perpetrated against. Well, then mom's going to be looked at for lack of supervision and protection. She didn't commit the crime, but she does need to keep this other kiddo safe. If it's a caregiver, a parent, an adult caregiver who legally meets the definition of a person who's responsible for the welfare of that child,
did we go over that? Did you
then
guys go over
we'll do that investigation, and the determination then is not only is there lack of supervision by one parent, but did somebody perpetrate sexual abuse against this child? And sex abuse is always a crime. So that's one of those cases where while, and this is hard for people to understand, while physical neglect, depending on the severity of it, and while physical abuse, depending on the severity, are what we handle in our civil situation, it really needs to be, it has to be pretty severe and significant before those things also then get referred to law enforcement to do their criminal behavior, their criminal investigation behind the scenes. They're two different
But the
streams.
sexual abuse
Sex
is
abuse is always a
automatically
crime.
criminal.
Children
Yes.
cannot consent to sexual activity until they're 16 years old. And then there's still parameters around how much older can the person, 16 is the age of consent in Montana for sex. Yeah, and it's been that way since I was a kid. 16. That's just been the law. There are parameters around how much age difference there are between, so if it's a 14 and a 16, they kind of look at that a little different than if it's a 14 and a 19. But that's criminal. They'll take care of that piece. But sexual abuse by the person responsible for the welfare of the child is something that CPS investigates. And like I said, that supervision piece gets looked at too. Was there something mom could have done or should have done or knew about that she could have kept the kid safe and she didn't? And then sexual exploitation. So child pornography pictures, the internet's not a good thing for a lot of stuff. And child sexual abuse and sex crimes against children actually, I think, increased. Certainly the distribution of child porn went up, because before you took pictures, you had to go to the local, Rexall Drug and get those pictures developed. Somebody else laid eyes on those photos, right? Or maybe Polaroid you just didn't have access like we do now. The media that we have now, phones take pictures, everything's pictures, really set
Download
kids
it on
up.
your computer.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's difficult. Do you have any questions about those broad categories that way, that we didn't address or talk about?
I just wanna hit on, caregiver, when we talk about caregiver, the legal definition, and it really is very specific. But anybody living in the household with a child that's of legal age is considered a legal caregiver as well. So live-in boyfriends, girlfriends, aunts, uncles, cousins, friends can also be held responsible for the care of a child. There's also a subsection of daycare. So when we have daycare allegations, we also investigate those, but we also run into these problems of kids that go to my friend Sarah's for daycare on Monday and Wednesday, and then they go to Head Start on blah, 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 okay? If it's on a schedule, they're considered a legal caregiver. So that comes into play quite a bit when you have to get down to the real details of a situation, if that's something that we're looking at. And again, with opportunistic, and not even sex abusers, but opportunistic people will babysit your kids for free. And you know, what mom is in poverty that wouldn't enjoy a free babysitter for a day, you know what I mean? So it just, that's something that falls under our category, I guess is my point.
I disagree with what mother would now. She's
Well,
just generalizing.
no, I'm
I want to
generalizing.
clarify something too. What she's talking about when she says we, she's meaning the statute authority that the division even has.
Yes.
So while we only have the authority to investigate the caregiver relative or the person responsible for that child's welfare in the home, we also then are responsible, they did put CPS in charge of licensed child care facilities and like the show dares of the world, you know, group homes, the staff that takes care of them in those facilities that are licensed, that's also an investigation that we would do. If a child is harmed in a situation that doesn't meet what we would look into, that still gets referred to law enforcement. It's a third-party assault then, and it's criminal investigation, not civil child protection investigation. That's where it gets kind of confusing for people. Our role isn't to hold somebody accountable for a criminal thing. We don't have that legal authority. We need to figure out, are kids safe in this home? Did this person do an action or omission that caused that harm? What can we do to mitigate it and keep them safe and keep that from happening again? And assess, do they even have the protective capacities to plug in people, services, whatever it is, that this isn't gonna happen to a child again? So, those free babysitters, while we wouldn't be doing the investigation, criminally, somebody would be doing that. It isn't that those kids fall through the cracks and nobody looks into it, it's just a matter of who does the work. And if, when we're doing an investigation about something that's clearly a crime, that referral goes to law enforcement and there's a joint investigation that's happening. Does that make sense? Please.
The second to the last, SAI, what does the I stand for?
Sexual abuse, incest.
Oh, thank you.
The codes, the 3-letter codes, are because on the computer system, where
Which is
they
antique.
list the people and then they have to figure out,
Right.
there's just 3 spots. So, yeah, sexual abuse, incest is different than sexual abuse,
Third party. SAT.
Yeah, but SAT's not on here because that's a different discussion. But the
SEC.
SEC, I'm not, sexual exploitation of a child. Okay, I didn't bother to read the,
Yeah, they
the
were all
stuff there.
understandable except SAI, I didn't know what the
yeah,
I
sexual
was.
abuse, incest. And the reason that they left it in the definition as the person responsible for the welfare of a child is you can have incest perpetrated on a family member that isn't the caregiver, the person responsible legally for the child. So we're visiting grandma's house and Uncle Johnny comes to visit and he perpetrates this child. That's not a us investigation, that's law enforcement on its own,
Because it's
okay?
a third party.
Yeah, we
assault
just
type of
can't,
deal.
yeah. Then we
But
look
is
at
that
protective
always?
capacity, we say, is grandma always gonna have this kiddo?
Yeah.
Does mom agree she's not gonna let Uncle Johnny back around? Do you know what I mean? Then you're
Yeah.
still looking at supervision, but you're not looking at Uncle Johnny's case. We don't do that. We don't like Uncle Johnny. No, I'm just kidding. Page 3, I just want to point this out to you. The hardest thing that we're going to ask you to do is have empathy for the parents that abuse their children.
You're gonna ask us to have empathy for us?
Because if you can't have
Okay.
empathy for the parents and find a place to understand why and how abuse and neglect can happen for a child, then it'll be really hard to work with the family towards reunification.
Which
And
is
that's
the
our
goal.
which is what we wanna do, that we have to do
I'm
that.
assuming that empathy is a lot easier in neglect than it is in abuse.
No,
Correct
not
or
necessarily.
incorrect? No?
Empathy comes from looking at these things, these risk factors, so let's talk about what the risk
Okay.
factors
Depending
are.
on whether you're.
They don't
a male or
equal
a female.
abuse. This is sort of that, what was finally the straw that broke the camel's back? It's a symptom. Child abuse is a symptom. Okay. Psychological disturbance and psychopathology among parents is a risk. A mother being young when she delivers children. Lack of education because they're limited in their ability to get jobs and work, right? History of child maltreatment of themselves. Parents who were abused as children don't have necessarily the same skill sets that those who came from a nurturing, loving home. Caregiver substance abuse is a contributing factor. Domestic violence certainly is a risk factor. Lack of social support. Parents who are isolated, don't have anybody to give respite. I had a family who could take my kiddos when I needed a break.
Network.
I had a network, right? Most of us do or did. Our parents don't always have any kind of a support system.
At
Maybe
all.
they've burned those bridges with their own family. Maybe their family was really abusive or neglectful, and now mom's young. She doesn't have a job. She's living on her own. She doesn't have somebody to help her. The chances start stacking, right? Lack of social support, unemployment, crises in the family. Maybe we're doing just fine, but now dad's had a heart attack and he can't work anymore. Now mom's stressed because she's having to work, and he's sick, and the kids are being kids, and she is up to here. And you know what? It doesn't take a lot then for somebody to do a behavior in a moment that brings them to our attention that it's a symptom, it's an issue, it's a risk that that's in there. So single parent families are at risk. Families with a lot of children, right? That's hard to manage when you start having too many kids. Premature births because they're med needy kiddos. That really is stressful for families. The temperament of a child, maybe they're colicky, maybe they're just willful. We all know those little shavers who just test your boundaries at every moment, you know what I mean? So maybe the temperament of a child isn't a risk factor in a basically healthy, functioning family, but it's not going to be a good thing if all the other stressors start adding up, and now you have this little one acting up, right? Retardation or mental handicap, emotional disturbances, physical disabilities put kids at risk. Immigration status, inability to have that support system, not speaking the language, not feeling like you can get the supports you need because you're fearful you're going to be deported. This is national
Do we
information, not
have a
just
lot of
Montana.
immigrants in this area?
This
Do you
is
see that?
national
Okay.
information. There are migrant status in Montana, so Kalispell, you've got cherries, apples, those kinds of things
Right.
going on. Sugar beets down by Billings area.
Right.
So there are migrant populations that come in and through Montana. It's not that we don't have a lot of them, but these are national statistics. So
Okay.
I believe this information I got you was out of our California curriculum for child abuse, child welfare. I have so lost my train of thought. Child Welfare Training Institute. That they are going to have a lot more immigration issues down there. But so these are all risk factors. Now, does that mean these things equal abuse? No. But like I said, we got to understand that there, by the grace of God, go any one of us. Okay? Yes.
So, are these parents always willing to share all this information with you? Particularly if they came from a bad home
We ask them.
and they answer?
We talk to them about it. Oh, yeah.
You
The
know, I
point
think-
is that the Ericas of the world would go out, meet the family, engage them, make them feel like they're not being judged, make them feel like we're not here to blame you, we're here to see, can we do something to help you make sure this isn't ever gonna happen again? And if you have it in you to talk to somebody and say hard things in a really kind way, they'll tell you anything.
And really, I think that some of these people are so isolated from healthy relationships. To have somebody listen to them and empathize with them and hear what they have to say, I think it moves miles in the relationship. And it's actually, I think it is one of the hardest things to really appreciate our parents. And I have to tell you, I could absolutely curse some of them out, but I wouldn't give any one of them up. When I know that we're having new workers come in, And I've really given thought to the clients that I would pass over to somebody and I won't give a single one of them up.
Territorial about your family.
I do, and I've got the young one with her
That's good.
boobs hanging out every visit, and I've got the one that curses me out every time she comes to see me, and then I've got the other one that, it's just, but I wouldn't give any of them up, and they really are so individual, and they are so, they're great people, and you have to get to that core and to appreciate that, and then they'll tell you anything you want to know.
And you have to ask those things. We didn't always do a good job of getting to know our parents very well in the past. Now the FFA, when we're looking at family functioning and we're looking at parent functioning and we're looking at child functioning, they are asking those specific questions. Well, let's talk about what was it like for you when you were growing up? Let's talk about that. What did this home look like in your house? What was the household composition when you were growing up? What did that look like? What did your mom do? What did your dad do? What kind of relationship did you have with
So you guys ask all these questions, you guys being CPS, right? When we do our reports, are we supposed to go in and ask the same questions?
You know what, I am gonna have to defer to Bill because I don't know what the
Uh-oh,
expectation
she
is
said
for you.
yes.
Yeah.
Hold that for Tuesday, this
Okay.
coming Tuesday, because that's the kind of stuff we want to talk about.
I think it's important for you to understand what goes on before you ever get a case. Because really, if you can understand what we have to look at, what we're keeping in mind, the kind of work that's happening with a social worker before a child comes into care, because you're not gonna see them until we have court action. I mean, you're there because now we've determined they cannot be safe in their parents' care, and we gotta figure out how to make it safe so they can go home. So these things have already happened, but when you're reading the report, it's easy to get hung up on mom did this or dad did this or didn't do this or this, and being angry and being punitive in your thought process. And we all want to go there, but it's not beneficial.
And my affidavit doesn't tell you the things that they have done. They followed through on where they really came to terms with a certain event. I mean, I don't stroke them at all in my affidavit. I mean, I have to give them the down and dirty of why are we here today.
Well, yeah, because you're